Good afternoon, and welcome back to another session on my Caribbean News Flash channel. Thank you so much for joining as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. And today's title is The Truth Fae Ellington Won't Tell You About Jamaican Patois. That's Fae Ellington. And we all know Fae Ellington. She is a Jamaican popular broadcaster and communicator. Now, Jamaican patois is loved across the world, but where did it really come from? Faye Ellington celebrates patois as the Jamaican language, but there's a deeper, more uncomfortable truth behind its origins. In this video, we break down the real history of patois, how it was created on slave plantations, why enslaved Africans were forced to mix languages, and why it is a Creole, not an ancient Jamaican tongue, what the original Jamaican language actually was, how colonialism shaped Jamaican speech, and why modern Jamaicans deserve the real truth or the full truth, not a romantic version of history, as we always like to do. Jamaican history is romanticized, particularly by our pseudo intellectuals that we have there. Now, patois is expressive, powerful, and culturally important, but its roots come straight out of the brutality of slavery. Then is 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 this a part, or this is a part of the story many avoid, but today we are putting it on the table. We like to, you know, put everything away from slavery, and we tend to be glorifying slavery, as it were, instead of trying to fight against the horrors of slavery and some of the experiences and some of the things that we inherited, some of the legacies of slavery, we are glorifying them. And one of them is even violence. And violence was intrinsically a part of slavery. Now, Jamaican Patois is one of the most recognizable languages in the world. It surely is. It's vibrant, emotional, musical, and it carries the spirit of the Jamaican people. So when Faye Ellington says Patois is the Jamaican language, she isn't wrong, but she isn't telling the whole truth either. Because the real history of Jamaican Patois doesn't start with independence or with African kingdoms or with Jamaican identity. It starts on the slave plantations. It begins when Africans were forced together, stripped of their original languages, and punished for speaking them. It begins with survival, not celebration. And we also had to communicate with Europeans, such as the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, of course, among other Europeans, and parts of their languages rather, were interwoven into what is known as Jamaican dialect or Jamaican Creole or Jamaican language. I think that every Creole or dialect we speak is a language. Why? Because a language is a simple definition of a language is that it is a tool of communication. And undoubtedly so, Patwa is a tool of communication. Nobody can argue that. It is very clear that people there are able to communicate in that language. However, what has happened over the years is that we have glorified this language to the point where I wonder if we are even trying to speak English anymore. I'm really wondering if we are even trying, attempting to master standard English or even to communicate in English. If we don't master it, but to be able to communicate in English. And we understand that English is a global language. The Creole is not a global language. And apart from the Bible, the New Testament, which is great, that Faye Ellington was actually brandishing on her latest video about Patois is a language or Jamaican, Jamaican is a language. Okay, she has not stated the science, the technology that Patois has created. Of course, we have done a few literature in terms of poetry coming from Louise Bennett and some other of our writers, but they are not necessarily, we're not getting the Nobel Peace Prize for that, of literature, the Nobel, not Peace Prize, but the Nobel Prize, I should say, for literature, based on our Jamaican literature in the Jamaican Creole, in the Jamaican dialect. It's not going to be done. It's not going to be done because we have not created any sort of, world class literature in that language, not to date. Okay, so the language unit at Jamaica at the University of the West Indies by host, I think it's still headed by Professor Demonish. He can talk all he wants to talk. And I've always asked, why is Devonish in Jamaica, promoting that sort of agenda? Are they promoting that at the University of Guyana, from which the country from which he hails, which have their dialect? Are they promoting Guyanese in the way we are promoting Jamaican? Or do they want their people there to express themselves in standard English? But we're always used as the guinea pigs. Jamaicans like to be used as slaves and guinea pigs. And that is what Professor Devonish is doing at the University of the West Indies at Mona campus. And uncritically, Fae Ellington is following him. Okay? Because at this point in time, when we see that we are so backward as a country, we have not been able to grow economy for the 63 years that we have been independent. We have not grown our economy to any great levels. Okay, and therefore we have a backward economy, we have a backward social structure and system in Jamaica. Okay, I was just speaking to my uncle and he was talking about there's somebody in Jamaica who wants to help, have him train to help to train workers because many of them lack basic skills. Basic skills, and they're coming from some of our best institutions. But we have glorified plantation like behaviors over time that right now I think that Jamaica has to be one of the most backward countries in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean for sure. Okay? And it starts at the language problem. And even in the Creole, I've said to many people, when you ask them to express themselves about something that happened, maybe they're going through a crisis and you're asking them to explain in the Creole what happened, they can't do it. They can't do it because of the deficiency of the language, that we don't read in the language. There's no sort of high culture expressed in that language. And what we find ourselves now are people who are just paralyzed when people pose a question to them. What happened? And very few people can even express it to any great detail in the Creole. What is going to happen to Jamaica if we do not raise the bar, if we don't lift the standard that we should be doing right now? And I think that is a problem, and we've got to raise the bar. We've got to raise the standard. Nobody there wants to speak English anymore. Everybody wants to speak Patwa because we're glorifying that which is coming from the plantation. Okay? Now, the real history of Patwa doesn't start with independence or with African kingdoms or with Jamaican identity. It starts on the slave plantations. It begins when Africans were forced together, stripped of their original languages, and punished for speaking them. It begins with survival, not celebration. And this is what we are saying. It's not a language that we want to celebrate. It's a language that we want to be able to develop in terms of our social you know um, gathering, enjoying ourselves among ourselves. But we must understand that we live in a global economy, in a global world, and we have to be able to communicate. Okay, we have to be able to communicate in within the global system. Okay, so a Creole is created when enslaved Africans must communicate with Europeans and each other. And that is how the language came about. It's a survival language built under forced conditions, not an indigenous language. Okay, so we all came together, the Portuguese, the Spanish, African countries coming together, the African slaves, and they were forced to communicate, and hence we call out of that sort of mixing came what is known today as the Jamaican dialect or the Jamaican language. We're not going to argue about whether or not it's a language, but what type of language is it? Is the language that can improve our economics, our political landscape, our legal landscape? What is the role and function of the language, of Jamaican language in the current Jamaican society and globally? These are the questions that we must ask. And Faye Ellington seems to be just uncritically speaking about and glorifying the Jamaican language because she's not bothered by it and she doesn't care. Jamaica had, Arawakan languages long before colonization. Indigenous languages, Jamaican Patois did not exist before the plantations. So it's not even a Jamaican language. It's a language that came from Europe, that came from Africa, and all over the world. Okay? So we have the Fon, the Akan, the Igbo gave vocabulary and grammar influences, but the superstructure is English, a hallmark of plantation Creoles. And that is what we have to understand. It is still an English derived language with a lot of influences coming from the Fon, the Akan, and the Igbo, and other among other African languages. Okay? So this is when we talk about language and the fact that the slaves had to communicate, and it was a system in which they had to be forced. They had no other choice but to be able to communicate with themselves and with their slave masters. So this is the legacy of slavery, not ancient Jamaican identity. Now, you can celebrate Patwa culturally without mythologizing its origins, as we like to do. We can celebrate it, nothing's wrong with the language. But the fact of the matter, glorifying it and saying that our kids should make attempt to speak it when they can't be understood globally, particularly as many of our citizens have to migrate because there's no economy in Jamaica that is made for them to function for the large majority of them. So, yes, Patois is beautiful. Yes, it is expressive. Yes, it is a legitimate language today, but its origins or its origin is not glorious. It is a linguistic wound of colonialism. So, if we want to get rid of all things colonial, it could be that of the Patois too, because it is indeed a colonial language. Okay? So Faye Ellington might emphasize culture and identity, which is fine, but she sidesteps the actual linguistic history of creolization under brutality and forced assimilation. And this is what she is doing. So we love our patois, but let's stop pretending it came from freedom, it came from slavery. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you like, share, and subscribe. Like the video so the video can be shared with as many people on the platform. And see you in another one. Ciao.